So I just want to kind of name the fact that when we talk about institutional racism, I've heard so much, since the George Floyd tragedy and our reflection in Britain on race and racism. It seems to be Black people who get asked about it, Black people who get asked, how are we going to solve this? And I just want to name that, because I am going to be asking some Black people. I mean, I'd like to first go to Nathaniel and ask him, like how do we move forward with dismantling the Master's house? How, do you think it's changes within the system, or do you think we need a revolution and a complete kind of overthrow of the system?
So first of all, greetings everyone, greetings those that are listening in, and give thanks to Phil, to yourself, Jess, to Sana as well. Amazing, and Professor Suman, of course. Amazing presentations, very informative. I mean, I like to be non-political with my answers. So, yes, revolution. Let me make that clear from the get-go. And for me, what backs it up is kind of in the title, Dismantling the Master's House, and then further to that from what Sana had put out from our honourable ancestor Audre Lorde, is that you can't expect the Master's tools to dismantle Master's house. So that's where revolution for me comes from. I think there were some great suggestions from Sana and Phil. However, I still would argue, I'll contest that is about reform. It's about trying to tinker, if the core is rotten, then one has to really think about, and I'm very multifaceted about approaches. So I'm not saying don't try and reform, but I'm saying how far would that get you? As Audre Lorde emphasized, you can change temporarily for a moment. And this idea of wanting to participate and be involved, one of our Black scholars, Dr. Naim Akbar, still living, he really talks about this idea of really wanting to participate, and he likens it to the plantation, you see. So when people of African descent managed to escape and free themselves from the plantation, many turned back because they saw no hope elsewhere. They didn't know any better. Dr. Marimba Ani refers to the Ma'afa. She's a strong activist, or was a strong activist, and it's referring to the fact that we were severed. People of African descent, people of the global majority, as touching on, were kind of cut off a lot from their history, their culture, their language, their everything that made them who they were. So you're without understanding of identity, and that mostly affected people from African descent. I've never seen a devastation of people who've had all of those things taken away from them, and the atrocities happen to them. Although it's been happening for years, and people say, "Oh, slavery's, it's not new," and there's different types. Even the word slavery coming from Slav. I was talking to one of my good friends earlier, and he's saying, "Yeah, no, but Slav, it comes from, that region." Well, when you have been separated from your identity, then you will look to whatever you see as success to go to, and so one would look to the plantation.
So I'm hearing that kind of reform is more where your heart lies.
That revolution.
Sorry, I completely mixed that up. Yes, revolution.
That's not to take away from reform. It's to say we should come at this on all different angles, however people feel their strength lies.
Yeah.
But understand that, reform is to me, it's a bit of a Stockholm syndrome. You keep going back and trying to tweak her and tinker, when really, it's not even saying let's destroy this whole system. What I'm proposing is let's kind of erect. I don't know whether there's been debates about whether a system can be put in place alongside. There's different constitutions across this land. We have the common law, as opposed to these, you know, collection of constitutions. So I think there's many different approaches, and it's about
So,
erecting the constitution.
so kind of both and.
Yeah,
Yeah.
summing up.
Colin, you do a lot of research, and you know, you've also worked as a social worker, I believe, and I'm wondering kind of what your position is on this kind of reform from within or revolution from outside. Would you like to talk on what Nathaniel's been saying?
Depends on your positioning. If you're a person who has been incarcerated in the mental health system, overtly medicated, abused systematically, violated with European medication, misdiagnosed, you want to blow down this house, nobody in it. That's the feeling. You want to start from the beginning. You want to also dismantle those systems that actually pathologize you, whether it be science, clinical psychology. You have no respect for these systems at all because you see the outcome. When you become part of the system, what Malcolm X could be believed to be called inside the house as a field, yeah, you begin to see that you need to work in a more collaborative co-production process with those colleagues. And it's really good that you've got Phil here because I think this is really vital. What the film didn't show you is which black people go through, which family calls this notion of negophobia, which is self-hatred. And two black men cried for 2 minutes about what was it like to be incarcerated in the system. And people need to see the emotional devastation of black people's lives before they understand what the system does to it. Let's not romanticize about what's going on. It's a political structure to dismantle interrelated structures that give credence to mental health as a misdiagnosis. It is not a science. And I hate the notion of clinicians and all these practices that have been invented to control the minds of black people need to dismantle. So I'm into dismantling. What I'm really into now is working across color lines. So we're working in a double consciousness to believe how can we work together to resolve this so we don't get into the polarized camps where we actually are not resolving it, we get into conflict. And lastly, if you're going to do research, it has no outcome for the overrepresentation of black people that are admitted in the system, people who are being falsely restrained, black women that are 5 times more likely to die in this mental system. Think about what your research outcomes are about. So that's what it is to dismantle it from my personal perspective.
Thank you, Colin. So you mentioned the kind of emotion of being incarcerated, racialized within the system. And, you know, like I work within the system, I work without the system. And it's hard. And I'm just wondering if, Sana, you could talk about how you found it. You know, you when you were talking about making real change, you were mentioning putting anti-racism into the curriculum, representation, changing recruitment, and also some individual stuff. But it must seem in the very title of this event, how is it being an insider in clinical psychology when you are using the master's tools? How emotionally is it?
Yeah, it's soul destroying a lot of the time. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really difficult one. I think it is incredibly exhausting, and I'm not going to try and sugarcoat that. I think I'm sure that this is something that some of you guys can relate to, trying to create change within the system. And I think, you know, Nat, you were talking about this whole revolution versus reform, and of course, I think, you know, for me, yes, in an ideal world, revolution would be wonderful. I think I am struggling to see what that looks like. And I think a big part of what revolution for me looks like is having a language. This is just one step, having a language where we can name our suffering and be with our suffering outside of this, you know, this tool of whiteness, which is, to me, diagnosis, that pathologizes and medicates and medicalizes our experiences of suffering and distress. That's one of the things, right? And in terms of when we're talking about revolution, that's where I see potentially something bigger shifting. But just going back to what you were saying, Jess, I think actually within it, in terms of what reform does for me, you know, I think it's just trying to celebrate the little shifts. And like, for me, even getting that research published was like very, very difficult, being a trainee and trying to even put that as what I wanted to do for my thesis in an incredibly white institution where there's all of the staff are racialized as white. And I was experiencing a lot of my own experiences of racism within those 3 years. So I think I just want to communicate the reality that it is exhausting and it is tough. It's a hard one because I don't want to say, don't come in here, don't do it, don't apply. Because I also feel like we need more people to come in to create reform. And I think in the meantime, reform is necessary before we can even get to the place of revolution. It's a really difficult one. I think it's just dancing the line between the two. I don't have a clear-cut answer, but these are the things that I'm grappling with, trying to think about being a revolutionary. That's the dream, really. But then also, I guess, practicing reform. So yeah.
As Colin said, kind of working over the colour line, I suppose everybody is reflecting on their relationship with race. You showed Resmaa Menakem's book, and that kind of, in that book, it talks about how white people hold race trauma too. And Phil, you kind of talked about that. You talked about your journey, if you like, through distancing, feeling really defensive, feeling the guilt, and then sitting with that. And that was 30 years ago. And I'm wondering if you feel like sitting with that guilt has changed your practice. Well, I know that you don't actually practice now, but has it changed how you're able to be with racism? I mean, how has it impacted you?
It had and still does have a profound impact on me. One of the outcomes of the meetings that we were having in Manchester was a community. Well, it wasn't a community development group, but it was the Manchester African Caribbean Mental Health Project, which we managed to get funding for, and that whole process really opened my eyes to so many things about white power and the resistances that white institutions will go through in order to prevent Black people having any say in what sort, and that's still happening to this day in Manchester, where I now am back again living. So yes, it had a profound effect upon me. It changed me as a person, and as a consequence of that, it enriched my life greatly. I have many dear Black and Muslim friends now in Manchester and in Bradford, both places where I've worked. And I think, yes, there are negatives, and the whole thing about white fragility is a very difficult thing to have to deal with, but you have to be with it. You have to sit with it. You have to bear the discomfort. That's nothing compared to the sort of horrors that Black people day in, day out go through in mental health services, their families and their loved ones. And it's absolutely nothing at all compared with the horrors that happened in slavery. So, it's as far as I'm concerned, it's actually a very, very small price to pay when seen in the broader context.
Yeah. So talking about racism is uncomfortable, embarrassing, and hard. Yet living with the impact of it is
you have to do
a million times worse.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so you've been in a system that's kind of grown, changed, I suppose. And Suman was talking about how we've lived through a period of political correctness. So racism has almost gone underground. And I'm wondering, Suman, but also maybe Phil, you can comment as well, like, would you say that racism is just different now, rather than being, like, having made progress? Is it easier to be a racialised person in the UK today than it was 30 years ago?
You're asking me, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I mixed up a little bit. Yes,
sorry, I missed what you said. Suman was not the name. Well, yes, yeah. I mean, I've been thinking about this quite a lot. I mean, when you get old, you think about what happened in your life. And of course, the 90s, late 90s, was much easier. People were polite to you. They didn't insult you. They didn't spit in your face, which I had before in the 60s. Even, you know, a lot of people had this. And, but at the same time, I think it was on my last visit to Canada. So it got life was much easier, and really one could get on with things. And so it was, I could see the benefits of racism going underground. I didn't, in a way, appreciate to what extent it was flourishing underground, actually, until I think my last visit to Canada about 3 years ago, walking down the street and somebody spat in my face, straight like that. And it was really, it brought me to earth that really there's something going on, even in Toronto, which was, I think, in a way much more, much more emancipated in some ways than London. And I firmly think now that it is the institutional racism. What I say, it's cultural racism. It's racism embedded in the culture. You feel upset at something, and it comes out as a overt racist action. You spit at the next black person you happen to see. And this sort of, I can understand this happening. You know, this is how we human beings behave. And it is a change of culture that is needed. And this is what Carmichael, well, he called himself Touré later, said, that he wrote in his prologue to the edition of his book, Black Power in America, published in 1990s. He gave a very short account, and he said the civil rights movement got a long way. They got voting rights. They stopped having the Ku Klux Klan sort of hanging people. Their life was much easier for everyone, and they nearly got the vote. They didn't get the vote really, in reality, till the last elections. And because there was a prevention of people casting their vote. But he said what we didn't do was affect institutional racism at all, and he regretted that. And he said, while that's carrying on, we can't rest in peace. You know, we can't rest. We have to keep going. He died soon after that, actually. And I think with this revolution, you contrasted revolution and reform. I mean, the two, I think of revolution as in the future. Maybe getting me off the hook as it was more revolution now, just as the Royal College, that's what their approach to some of us demanding fairly quick change has been. Oh yes, we need all these changes, but not now. Perhaps a little later. And there's a sort of gem of common sense in that. It's all big revolutions, the French Revolution, Chinese Revolution, the revolutions everywhere. Even in Sri Lanka, there was a revolution by one community against the other, dominated. The aims are wonderful, and the expectations are high. That's why they pursue into militancy and aggression and violence. But the outcomes are often 50-50. Sometimes it's worse than before. Russia and China. And one, I think, must learn from that. And the revolution is perhaps something to a vision. That is what we want, fundamental change. But to get there, we have to start pushing wherever we can. And that is what we should be doing, I think.
Yeah, And I suppose education comes into it. But I've also heard kind of critique of unconscious bias trainings, as in which, you know, a form of educating people around the racism that they hold without realizing, and kind of where
don't go with unconscious bias training at all.
Yeah, would you like to say why?
It psychologizes a social problem, actually. I think that is a short answer to that. And psychologizing, like psychiatricizing, making something into an illness, is actually evading the problem. Yes, maybe we have unconscious biases, and maybe we don't. It's a matter of opinion. It's a matter of psychological theory, whether it's unconscious or not.
And this ties in a bit with what Sana was saying about intellectualizing racism, not feeling it in the body, and I suppose talking about it in quite a heady way, you know, turning it into a psychological theory. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to would anybody else like to comment on that? You know, how we do now see a great mass of unconscious bias training for people for workers in the NHS, for workers in various charities, to try and make organisations more anti-racist. You know, like since COVID and George Floyd, like there has been a massive increase in people talking about racism, talking about their unconscious biases. How do we translate that into actual change within psychiatry? Has it changed anything? And that's to anybody who wants to comment. We don't have that long left.
Can I make a comment about that? I don't think it is going to change anything, because I think ultimately these are matters of power. That people have to accept that. So it's a point that Suman makes very eloquently in his book. Racism is a matter of power before it's anything else. And that's why I think it's understandable that people speak about revolution. I just want to say one thing about that, and that is a great poet, black poet of the 1960s and 70s, Gil Scott Heron, wrote a poem called "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." And I think that although he was, you know, it had different meanings for people in those days, I think what I take from that is that whenever you do try and resist the power of institutions and to try and upset them, turn them around, turn them over, they will be deaf to that. They won't listen to it. They will resist it. So we have to keep battling away.
Let me say something. You've got to see psychiatry within a neoliberal commodity climate. It does not operate in a political and economic vacuum. And unless we understand that, we're not going to dismantle this house. If you have a body of knowledge and information that's contributing to one group of people being overrepresented year in, year out, if not fit for purpose, and if you've ever been in the mental health system, I know Phil does, it's the commodification of the black body for a new economic relationship, which is slavery. Schizophrenia is the new defamation in the modern age. Unless we get that, we've got to embrace ourselves for a civil rights, empowerment, liberation approach to mental health and take it that seriously. And ask the government for a national inquiry in why 2011. We've got data, because everybody's obsessed with the science of the black body. Everybody's obsessed with it. How can we measure it? How do we know about it? Yeah? We know economically and politically there are inherent processes of discrimination that are transferred into the mental health system. Just like the education system, criminal justice, they're all interrelated systems that contribute towards this awful thing called mental disorder. It gets me mad. The disease of the mind that needs to be broken into pieces. So we need to get away from the micro discussions to get to these bigger discussions, to galvanize communities to come together to challenge, just like the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And the Black Lives Matter is a fundamental underpinning campaigning organisation for this actually happened. We've got to challenge this because that's the only way we can dismantle it. We can't do it in our individual spaces.
So it's systemic, it's linking it to neoliberalism and capitalism.
Well, I don't say, I'm not going to give you a definition of capitalism, but if you do a mental health assessment, and Phil knows this, I want to assess somebody before I get a bed. And I've got to negotiate how much that body's actually going to cost me to get that bed in there. When I've got a care management system to economically assess how much I'm going to have this body, I don't economically assess the discharge arrangements. It's a wider process. It's a conveyor belt of oppression of the black body. Yeah, that starts from the misdiagnosis. It starts from the incarceration, discharge, inappropriate services. And I feel sorry for lots of psychologists and psychiatrists, because you're actually getting somebody who's so institutionally structurally damaged, going to do that small part of it. And to politicize counseling and psychotherapy is quite difficult. I'm just trying to say it's a big, massive issue. If we dismantle it, we've got to put these pieces together, really understand the deeper underpinning issues that are leading to racism and mental health work. And research is now going to show that.
Yeah. So not just focusing on mental health institutions.
Mental health is not about mental health. It starts from pre-production slavery. It travels through from post-colonialism. It enters into our educational system. It enters in, when I was in prison, that's what we experienced in prison. When I went to the ward, it was the same process of demigration of our black minds. So it systemically travels through. If we break up into one small system, we're going to miss the wider responsibilities of everybody working in the system.
It's everywhere. Does anybody have any comments they want to make before we move on to the Q&A?
I mean, I would just want to add, you mentioned Professor Suman about Stokely Carmichael, or known as we know as Kwame Ture, one of my heroes and who I kind of model a lot on. And I just think some quotes, kind of what Colin touched on, can really be summed up by some of the things that he said. So when I think about, as I mentioned myself as a Pan-Africanist, and that's not to take away my deep passion of the human race and wanting, you know, our earth to continue to exist, to develop, and all living things in it to grow and prosper and you know, evolve. But there's something that Kwame Ture said, a few quotes. He said, before a group can enter the open society, it must first close ranks. So it's indicating that groups that have been heavily oppressed, they need to do some healing. It's been mentioned in the chat a few times. And I know some of my colleagues that work on mindfulness, and I know some of the great work that you do, Jess, is involved in about rehabilitating, restoring, repairing, healing. But he also mentions that there is a higher law than the law of government. That's the law of conscience. And so when we look to the government, because straight away, as soon as we talk about mental health and psychiatry, I just see it as one of the symptoms to the cause, which is the system of, you know, some people say white supremacy, some people say white terrorism, white violence. And so you need to challenge that or combat that. Of course, the tool that's been used heavily is reparations.
Can I say something that just very short, because I think we need to move on to the Q&A. About what you said about closing ranks, etc. That is all revolutionary parties from the Labour Party downwards has always said this, and sometimes it's very brutally done. And there are probably reservations about closing ranks.
I think that's
very
very
people who don't agree with you.
Yeah, no,
Right.
similar to.
But but I'll just leave that. I think when I came, again going back to personal, when I came here, I was black for the first time in the 50s. When I came in the 60s, I was BME, and a little while later, because black became respectable term. When I first came, black was a term of abuse almost, actually, to be black. That was an abusive term. But that had been changed revolutionary way by the Black Power movement. You know, black was actually respectable. I was proud to be black. And when I came, I wasn't black anymore. I was BME. And BME was getting that sort of pejorative meaning. And so it became B and ME, B and Asian. and now I'm not quite sure what it is, but it made me think, and certainly others have said this, that this unity, there's a sort of unity in the 60s where we were all black. Those who opposed had the common experience of racism in our upbringing or in our histories. We were black because white, if you are not black, if you are not white, you are black, and that's no, and if you said you are not black, you are nothing, you just didn't exist. So we were black. But there is a part of this is the old, very old divide and rule. And this came up very dramatically for me in the Mental Health Act review, when the lead of the review spoke to me personally, asked me to get involved in actually helping him to draw up the final conclusions, etc. And I was told, but somebody wanted me to be in the consultation group for African and Caribbean people, because a lot of the writing about this, if not the research, had been from me, so I would bring that in. But I was told that he decided that I wasn't black enough to be in that group, that it was only for people of African and Caribbean heritage, and I was Asian. So BME had broken into this sort of unity. And I think we ought to be aware of the way the system itself, the present colonial system in this country, colonizes different groups and separates them so that they don't get together and have what you're asking for, a revolution.
I mean, there is definitely more power in unity. But I suppose one of the critiques of lumping everybody together in BAME is that differences get lost. So I suppose, again, it's a both and. Yes, there's more power in us all being together, but also there are differences in how we are racialized.
Well, I would, I'm taking a very practical approach. That's theory. That's fine for discussion groups like this and for arguments in academia. But in reality, it's actually when you're faced with the facts of life, we need what Nat was saying, Daniel was saying, we need to close ranks.
Yeah.
If you're going to get anything like a revolution, anything like fundamental change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I want to thank all our wonderful panelists. I'm going to hand over now to John, who's going to manage the Q&A from the audience. But yeah, thank you.